The island's grim silhouette. The ferry horn let out a final, mournful lowing, a sound that died against the thick, gray veil of the Oakhaven mist before the vibration of the engines even faded. Rachel stood at the edge of the rusted iron pier, her camera dangling by its strap against her chest, watching the white foam churn behind the departing vessel. The water wasn't the sparkling blue of a vacation brochure, it was the color of bruised slate, cold and depthless. Beside her, Sarah didn't look at the boat. She looked at the shoreline, where the trees seemed to lean inward, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky like fingers frozen in a mid-convulsion reach. "It's smaller than it looked on the map," Sarah said. Her voice was steady, but she pulled her jacket tighter, the fabric snapping in the sudden, sharp wind. "The island. It feels compressed." Rachel turned, a frantic, electric energy sparking in her eyes. She hadn't heard the cynicism in her friend's voice. She was too busy scanning the tree line, checking for the landmarks from her online threads. "It's supposed to be like this, Sarah. Isolation is the point. The Blackwood legends don't thrive in places with high foot traffic. They need the vacuum." "They need a grave," Sarah countered, stepping off the pier onto the shingle beach. The stones crunched, a wet, sucking sound that made her wince. "We're the only ones here, Ratch. The captain didn't even look at us when we paid. He just wanted the ramp up." Rachel ignored the warning, her boots finding the trailhead marked by a gnarled, blackened oak that looked like it had been struck by lightning repeatedly for a century. She started walking, her movements quick, bird-like. "He's a local. They don't mess with the manor's perimeter." That's what the thread said. "They're terrified of the history." Sarah caught up, her pace measured, eyes darting to the tangled undergrowth. It was unnatural, how the brush seemed to knot itself together, weaving a wall that blocked any view of the surrounding island. History is one thing. This feels like intentionality. "Look at these." She pointed to a cluster of wooden placards nailed haphazardly to a dead trunk near the path's start. They were weathered, the paint flaking away like dead skin, but the symbols were clear. They weren't standard, no trespassing signs. They were hand-carved, depicting faces twisted in agony, eyes gouged out, mouths sewn shut. Rachel stopped, leaning in, her thumb brushing the jagged wood. Ritualistic warnings. Probably put up by the kids who come here for the aesthetic. "Keeps the tourists away." "Or keeps something in," Sarah whispered. She didn't touch the wood. She could feel the vibration of the forest, a low-frequency hum that didn't come from the wind or the waves. It was a rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat buried beneath the silt. "Rachel, look at the orientation. These carvings aren't facing the shore. They're facing the path. They aren't warning us away. They're mocking us for entering." Rachel didn't answer immediately. She pulled her camera up, the lens clicking as she adjusted the focus, snapping a picture of the central, most grotesque carving. The flash was blinding, a harsh white strobe against the oppressive gray of the fog. For a split second, the light illuminated something deeper in the woods, a glint of something metallic, or perhaps bone, caught in the thorns. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her hand instinctively finding Rachel's elbow. "Just the play of light," Rachel said, though her voice wavered. She pushed forward, her adventurous spirit now tinged with a brittle sort of defiance. "It's exactly what I wanted to find. Don't you see? The atmosphere, the isolation, this is the real deal. It's not just a story." "It's not a story if you don't come back from it," Sarah said, but she followed. As they moved deeper into the treeline, the air grew heavy, saturated with the smell of wet earth and something metallic, the faint, copper tang of old blood. The path narrowed, the trees closing in until the canopy overhead blotted out the last of the natural, gray daylight. They were walking through a tunnel of rotting timber and weeping moss. Every 10 yards, they passed another marker. Each was slightly different, the art style evolving as they moved further inland. The faces on the carvings began to lose their human features, becoming elongated, skeletal, and monstrous. Why are there so many? Rachel asked, her breath hitching. She reached out to touch a knot in the wood, but pulled back as if burned. The surface was warm, unnaturally feverish. Because the path is long, Sarah replied, her pragmatic mind failing to categorize the phenomenon. She stopped and turned, looking back the way they had come. The path was gone. Behind them, the forest had knit itself into a solid, impenetrable curtain of briar and shadow. There was no tunnel, no path back to the shore. Just a tangled mess of branches that looked as if they had been woven by a giant spider. Rachel, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a tremor. Don't look back. What is it? The path closed. Rachel spun around, her face pale. She lunged toward the wall of vegetation, pulling at the thick, woody vines. They didn't move. They felt like steel cables wrapped in damp velvet. She yanked harder, tearing her fingernails against the bark, but the forest held firm. It's a trick, Rachel hissed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage. It's a psychological barrier. It's supposed to force us to keep going. That's the mechanism of the manor. The architecture is designed to make you feel like you have no choice. It feels pretty real when you're trapped, Sarah said, though she forced her breathing to stay rhythmic. She moved to Rachel's side, placing a hand on her friend's shoulder to anchor her. If we can't go back, we have to keep going forward. But we do it carefully. No more running toward the noise. Rachel nodded, her composure returning as the adrenaline settled into a cold, hard focus. She wiped her hands on her jeans, smearing a bit of dark sap across her thigh. Right. Forward. To the manor. If the island is playing games, we play back. We get the footage, we document the ritual, and we find the exit. And if there is no exit? Sarah asked. Rachel looked toward the center of the island, where the trees began to thin, revealing the jagged, looming silhouette of Blackwood Manor against the bruised twilight sky. It was a monstrosity of Victorian architecture, all peaks and gables, looming like a predator crouched in the dark. Then we make one, Rachel said, her voice hardening into something sharp. They started walking again, faster this time, moving toward the clearing. As they walked, the forest around them seemed to shiver, the leaves rustling in a wind that they could no longer feel. The thrumming in the ground increased in tempo, matching the frantic pulse of their own hearts, leading them toward the threshold of the house that had been waiting for them since before they were born. The salt-crusted silence of the shoreline retreated as they pushed into the tree line. The transition was abrupt, a surgical snip between the open sea and the suffocating tangle of Oakhaven's interior. Rachel didn't slow down. She crunched over rotted cedar needles and exposed, gnarled roots that seemed to grip the earth like arthritic fingers. Her phone was held high, a glowing talisman against the encroaching gloom, its screen flickering with a signal that was rapidly dying. Rachel, wait, Sarah said, her voice tight. She stopped, her boots sinking into a patch of black, viscous mud that smelled faintly of copper and stagnant water. Look at the trees. Look at the way they're leaning. Rachel didn't look back. She navigated around a fallen oak, her movements jittery, fueled by that familiar, dangerous cocktail of adrenaline and digital obsession. It's just an old-growth forest, Sarah. The wind patterns on the island are weird. Everything hits the manor side first. It's topography, not a conspiracy. It's not the wind, Sarah insisted, stepping carefully over a knot of briars that seemed to recoil from her proximity. The branches. They aren't swaying. They're locked. Every single one of them is angled toward the house. Like they're pointing. Rachel finally paused, turning to face her friend. The shadows in the canopy above were thick, weaving together to block out the remaining slivers of daylight. Her face was flushed, her eyes too wide, reflecting the frantic pulse of the phone's dying battery. You're doing that thing again, Rachel said, though the sharp edge of her excitement had dulled, replaced by a jagged, uncomfortable edge of irritation. The Sarah pragmatism filter. You're looking for a reason to turn back because you're scared. We came here to see if the legends held any weight. If we stop now, we're just two tourists who got spooked by a few overgrown pine trees. I'm not doing anything, Sarah retorted, her voice dropping to a low, urgent hum. I'm looking at the reality. Look at the path, Rachel. When we started, it was a trail. Now, it's a trough. The brush on either side is so dense it's effectively a wall. We aren't walking toward the manor anymore. We're being guided. There's a difference. Rachel scoffed, but she took a step back, her gaze darting to the wall of thorns. Sarah was right. The foliage wasn't just overgrown, it was woven. Thick, thorny vines were interlaced with such geometric precision that it looked less like nature and more like a fence. She reached out to touch a strand of ivy, intending to push it aside, but jerked her hand back before her skin made contact. The thorns weren't just sharp, they were obsidian black, shimmering with a wet, unnatural sheen. We have plenty of light, Rachel muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. She turned her phone to illuminate the path ahead. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but the endless, rhythmic repetition of trees. We just need to clear the ridge. Once we get to the clearing, the path will open up. You'll see. Why are you so invested in this? Sarah asked, her tone shifting from pragmatic caution to a raw, wounded vulnerability. Seriously, Ratch. It's just a house. It's a rot-filled shell in the middle of nowhere. Why does it feel like you're trying to run toward it? Rachel went rigid. She didn't answer immediately. A cold draft swept through the trees, not a breeze, but an exhale. It carried the scent of dust, century-old parchment, and something metallic, like blood drying on stone. Because, Rachel whispered, the word barely escaping her throat. She looked down at her own hands, then back at the dark, winding path ahead. Because for the last year, I've felt like I was sleepwalking. Everything felt gray. Every class, every party, every conversation, it was all just noise. But when I read about this place, when I started digging into the archives, into the history of this island, it was the first time I felt awake. I need to know why. We don't need to be awake if it means we end up like the missing persons in the reports, Sarah countered, stepping forward and grabbing Rachel's sleeve. We're leaving. Now. If the trail is blocked, we'll backtrack to the shore. We'll signal the ferry pilot. The ferry is gone, Sarah. Then we wait. We signaled the mainland. Rachel pulled away, her movements sharp, almost bird-like. There is no waiting. Look. She gestured toward the path they had just traversed. The thick, woven wall of briars had closed completely behind them. Where there had been a gap, there was now a seamless curtain of knotted, suffocating thorns. The air grew heavier, the silence so profound it felt like a pressure against their eardrums. Sarah stared at the wall of spikes. Her breath hitched. She spun around, checking the sides of the path, then forward. The forest had become a funnel. The ground beneath their feet, previously damp earth, was hardening, turning into a cracked, gray stone that seemed to pulse with a low-frequency hum. We didn't walk into this, Sarah whispered, her pragmatism shattering under the weight of the impossible. We were invited. Rachel's posture shifted. The fear that had been flickered in her eyes was being eclipsed by a dark, intense fascination. She took a step toward the darkness, her gait losing its nervous rhythm, replaced by something steady and deliberate. Do you hear that? Rachel asked. Sarah didn't want to listen. She wanted to scream, to run, to beat her fists against the thorns until they bled. But the sound was unavoidable. It was a rhythmic, scratching noise, like a quill moving across vellum at high speed. It wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from the ground, from the very stones beneath them. Rachel, don't, Sarah warned, reaching out again. But Rachel was already moving. She stepped onto the strange, gray stone floor of the path, her boots making a sharp, hollow click. She didn't look back, her gaze fixed on the distance, where the canopy finally began to thin. Sarah stood alone for a heartbeat, the encroaching forest pressing in on her, the thorns twitching with a life of their own. She looked at the wall of briars, then at the path, then at the back of her friend. The loyalty that defined her, the anchor she had always been, pulled at her, overriding the screaming instinct to flee. She took a breath, the air tasting of ozone and ancient static, and followed. They walked in silence for a time, the forest floor beneath them shifting from stone back to dirt, though it felt different, though thinner, as if the earth were merely a veneer covering something much older and much harder. The trees began to thin, and the oppressive canopy gave way, revealing a sky that was a bruised, sickly violet. "Sarah," Rachel called out, her voice low and strangely resonant. Sarah emerged from the tree line and stopped. The clearing opened up like a wound in the earth. And there, standing in the center of the decay, was the manor. It was larger than the photos had suggested, a jagged, sprawling monolith of Victorian Gothic architecture that seemed to defy the laws of gravity. Its spires reached up like broken fingers clawing at the sky, and its windows were dark, hollow sockets that stared back at them with a predatory intelligence. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a focal point. Everything on the island seemed to gravitate toward it, the very gravity of the clearing pulling them toward the rotted, wide-open front door. "It's not just haunted," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Rachel, it's feeding." Rachel stood on the edge of the threshold, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She looked at the door, then back at the woods, then at Sarah. The fear was gone, replaced by a terrifying, wide-eyed clarity. "We can't go back," Rachel said. It wasn't a realization, it was an acceptance. Sarah looked at the dense, wall-like barrier of thorns behind them. It had grown thicker, pulsing with the same rhythm as the manor's windows. "No," Sarah agreed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "We can't." They stood on the precipice of the unknown, the manor looming over them, waiting. With a shared look, a final acknowledgement of the life they were leaving behind, they crossed the line of the clearing, their boots crunching on the dead grass, and stepped onto the porch of Blackwood Manor. The tree line broke with a sudden, violent finality. Rachel and Sarah stumbled out of the suffocating embrace of the forest and onto the jagged perimeter of the clearing. Before them, Blackwood Manor rose from the rot like a splintered bone protruding from the earth. It was not merely a house, it was a testament to architectural cruelty. High, vaulted windows stared down like cataract-filmed eyes, and the structure itself seemed to lean forward, straining against the foundations to catch whatever whispered secrets the wind carried from the sea. Rachel halted, her breath hitching in her chest, not from the exertion of the trek, but from the sudden evaporation of her bravado. She had spent months scrolling through grainy forums, analyzing overexposed photos of this place, but the digital versions had been hollow. They lacked the smell. The air here was heavy, metallic, and thick with the cloying, sweet stench of ozone and stagnant water. "It's not abandoned," Sarah whispered. Her voice, usually sharp with pragmatic logic, was thin and brittle. She hugged her arms across her chest, her fingers digging into the fabric of her jacket. "Buildings like this, they don't just sit empty. They wait." Rachel didn't answer. She found herself unable to pull her gaze away from the grand entrance. The heavy oak doors, carved with twisting, indecipherable motifs that seemed to writhe in the failing light, stood slightly ajar. A sliver of absolute, hungry darkness bled from the gap, darker than the night surrounding it. "We should go back," Sarah said, her voice growing firmer as the primal part of her brain registered the threat. She took a step toward the tree line, then stopped. She turned back, her eyes wide. "Rachel." "The path." "Where is it?" Rachel turned. Behind them, the forest had changed. The brambles and pines that had guided them, or rather, herded them, through the island had knit themselves into a solid, impenetrable wall of thorns and shadow. The trail they had arrived on had been erased, swallowed by a dense, pulsating thicket of black briars. "It's just perspective," Rachel said, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "The light is failing. We're just disoriented." "We aren't disoriented," Sarah snapped, her pragmatism flaring into a defensive rage. "We're trapped. This is exactly what the legends said, the ones you called atmospheric embellishments. It's a closed loop." Rachel took a tentative step toward the house. Her boots crunched on the gravel, the sound amplified by the unnatural stillness of the clearing. The silence wasn't empty, it was pressurized, like the moment before a thunderclap. "Look at the windows, Sarah," Rachel said, pointing toward the third floor. At first, there was nothing. Then, a flicker, a pale, translucent shape darting behind the glass. It moved with a grace that was entirely non-human, a fluid motion that defied the rigid geometry of the house. "I saw it too," Sarah breathed. Her skepticism had been stripped away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline terror. "That wasn't a trick of the light." "We can't go back," Rachel said, her voice dropping to a low, hollow register. She felt a strange, magnetic pull emanating from the threshold of the manor. It wasn't fear, exactly, it was an invitation, a tugging at her very marrow, as if the house recognized her. The forest closed the road. "The only way forward is through." Sarah moved beside her, her shoulder brushing Rachel's. She didn't argue. The pragmatist in her had assessed the landscape and accepted the grim reality. They were prey, and the house was the predator's den. To stand in the clearing was to invite whatever was watching from the eaves to descend. "If we go in there," Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute, "we don't look for ghosts. We look for a back door. We don't touch anything, we don't say anything, and we leave the second we find an exit." "Agreed," Rachel murmured. As they crossed the threshold of the porch, the temperature plummeted. The wood beneath their feet felt soft, almost porous, like walking on rotted flesh. Rachel reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the iron knocker, which was fashioned into the shape of a screaming gargoyle. She didn't need to knock. As if sensing their proximity, the oak door groaned, the hinges crying out like wounded animals, and swung wide. The foyer beyond was cavernous, lit only by the dying embers of a chandelier that seemed to sway without a draft. Dust motes danced in the stagnant air, catching the faint twilight. The floor was inlaid with dark, swirling marble, and at the far end of the hall, a grand staircase curled upward, disappearing into a throat of velvet shadow. Rachel stepped across the threshold, her pulse racing in rhythm with the house's heartbeat, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the soles of her shoes. "It's not just a house, Sarah," Rachel whispered, the realization settling into her bones, cold and heavy. "It's a stomach." Sarah stepped in behind her, shutting the door. The sound of it clicking shut, a final, absolute metallic thud, echoed through the house, waking something in the walls. Deep within the architecture, something began to shift. A heavy, mechanical grinding started beneath the floorboards, the sound of ancient gears finally engaging after decades of dormancy. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. "I felt it," Rachel replied. She turned to the door, grabbing the handle. It didn't budge. The iron had fused, the metal cold and biting against her skin. They were no longer thrill-seekers. They were specimens. Above them, on the landing of the stairs, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. It stood tall, too thin, its silhouette elongated and distorted. It didn't move toward them, yet it was closer than it had been a second ago. "Welcome," a voice echoed, not from the landing, but from the very air around them. It was smooth, cultured, and layered with the kind of malice that only comes from centuries of patient, undisturbed hunger. "I have been expecting you both for a very long time." Rachel stood her ground, her curiosity warring with the violent instinct to flee. She looked up at the darkness on the landing, her hands balling into fists. "Who are you?" The shadow shifted, resolving into the form of a man in a sharp, vintage suit, a man who looked as though he had stepped out of a period piece, his face a mask of predatory elegance. David Thorne smiled, and in the dim light, his teeth looked far too sharp. "I am the curator," he said, descending the stairs with a slow, hypnotic gait. "And you, my dear girls, are the final pieces of the collection." Sarah lunged forward, her pragmatic instinct shifting into a desperate, feral need to neutralize the threat. "Like hell we are," she spat. But as she moved, the floorboards seemed to shift under her feet, undulating like the surface of a deep, dark pool. The house was changing, the walls narrowing, the ceiling pulsing with a bioluminescent, sickly light. The exit was gone. The transition had begun.